All right, so the paper I'm going to present today is joint with Felipe Alves, who was at Bank of Canada, so the usual disclaimer applies, and it's there at the bottom. All right, so the starting point of this paper is the reassessment of the monetary policy framework of the Fed, which happened in around the summer of 2020. I mean, clearly the Fed still has a dual mandate. Okay, it's one of the few central banks that has a dual mandate. The two pillars are price stability, which is the sort of the common pillar of every central bank in the world, and the second, which is quite peculiar to the Fed mission, is maximum employment. There are some new features in these two sort of pillars that the new framework established. The first one is sort of a shift from what macroeconomists, monetary economists called a strict inflation target to an average inflation target or flexible inflation target. Okay? Where the Fed is trying to basically make up for past shortfall inflation with like a higher future inflation. So it's targeting some sort of past average of inflation being around 2%, not just the current inflation level. The second change to the mandate in a way, or at least reinterpretation, is a bit too it's even more substantive in a way. It has two parts. The first part is to reinterpret basically what informs monetary policy so shift basically from deviations of employment from a maximum level to shortfalls only of employment to its maximum level, which suggests some sort of asymmetry, if you like, in monetary policy. Okay, so doing different things in expansion and recession. The second is a broader reinterpretation of maximum employment as a broad-based and inclusive goal. This second reinterpretation comes really from a lot of background work that the Fed did, and in particular, there were all these events that the Fed organized, they're called Fed Listens events, where the Fed officials would meet sort of with local communities and people, entrepreneurs, business owners, and just common people in local communities to basically debate, what a central Fed could do for them. And here's a summary of this Fed Listens event, which are in a volume of like 300-page volume. One clear takeaway from the Fed Listens was the importance of sustaining a strong job market, particularly for people from low and moderate income communities. Okay, so if you combine all this together, what appears is that the Fed is following a different strategy, which we're going to summarize as kind of lower for longer, so lower rates for longer, during recovery. That runs the economy hot for longer after a recession, if you like. So this idea that running the economy hot for longer is especially beneficial to, say, low-wage people, it's not a new idea. Okay, in fact, it goes back to a very old paper by at least an old paper by Arthur Okun, which is called Upward Mobility in a High-Pressure Economy, where the idea developed and articulated by Okun, it was 1973, so it was 50 years ago, before the rational expectation revolution, before economists started really writing consistent macroeconomic models based on mathematical equations. So if you read this paper, it's all a little sort of descriptive. But the idea is clearly there. The idea is that sustaining what he calls a high-pressure economy, so an economy that always operates close to maximum potential, improves the economic outcomes of low-wage workers by allowing them to find steady employment, build their skills, and climb the job ladder. Right? At the same time, Okun recognized the cost of doing this. Okay? And he writes, the sacrifice of upward mobility, because he mostly talked in terms of upward mobility, must be reckoned as one high cost of accepting slack as an insurance policy against inflation. So I understood that the cost of doing this is possibly higher inflation. So against this background, what do we do in this paper? We ask three questions. The first is, okay, if we really want to think about this idea that running the economy hot for longer can especially benefit low-wage people, sort of assess the framework of the Fed against this idea, you have to formalize this Okun's hypothesis within a macro model. So that's the first thing that we do. The second thing is we ask the following question. Can the lower for longer strategy actually run an economy hot for longer, and if so generate a meaningful, what we call inflation inclusion trade-off, okay? So meaning essentially being especially beneficial for people at the bottom of the distribution, while at the same time we know generating some cost in terms of inflation, and sort of we can assess this trade-off. And the third question, which comes very natural, obviously, after we ask this, is can this trade-off be sustained in the long run? Because this policy is going to generate an inflation bias that is actually the opposite of the ZLB. It's going to generate possibly a positive inflation bias. And then we need to think about, how wage setters sort of deal with this with kind of higher inflation.
You are really focusing on the period after the Great Recession and not on the current period.
No, okay. I'm going to be focusing on our quantitative analysis is going to be basically covering 1980 to 2020, which was just before COVID. Okay, but I think we should talk about, if you like, maybe later about the COVID experience, because if anything, it kind of one. Let me say just one quick thing, that one interpretation of the Fed's behavior after the COVID shock was precisely kind of this lower for longer, okay? Because after the shock, obviously, after the shock, right? The economy, the labor market was very tight, and yet the Fed did not raise interest rates for a while, right? So precisely in line with this idea that it was a tight labor market, at the beginning there was no, worrying sign of inflation, or at least, on paper. And so the Fed just, delayed hiking rates. Okay, so how do we address these three questions? So we're going to build a quantitative model which combines features of heterogeneous agent model and the standard Keynesian framework that features three states in a frictional labor market: employment, unemployment, and non-participation. Right? So in some sense, you will see it's a more general model than some of the models out there. In some sense, it's a bit more restrictive. But we really wanted to introduce this non-participation margin, and in general, the participation decision, because we think it's a really central notion when we talk about labor market outcomes or low-wage people. A lot of the discussion is about the participation rate and the sort of how to basically bring more of low-wage people, low-skilled people into the labor market then we introduce aggregate demand and supply shocks. So we have a kind of business cycle model. And I'm going to show you basically that Okun's hypothesis in our economy will be sort of at work through three different channels that I'm going to call exposure, attachment, and persistence. Okay, and I will define them and explain them later. But basically, in brief, we're going to incorporate into the model the feature that low-skilled people are more exposed to the business cycle. That for them, this sort of attachment to the labor force is more important because obviously they're more marginal. And that there are persistent and protracted effects of recessions that generate sort of persistence and to some extent hysteresis in the economy that are especially important for the low-skilled people. The paper is really focused on trying to model, I think, as carefully as we can, the labor market and the sort of the impact of this policy across in terms of labor market outcome across the distribution. Okay, we're going to think of inflation as a cost, because inflation in this model, is basically is a reflection or manifestation of the gap between the marginal rate of substitution and the marginal product of labor. Okay, as in sort of standard Keynesian model, and that's the sense in which inflation is a cost. We're going to sort of by purpose kill all the other effects of inflation across the distribution. Okay. But I completely agree. I mean, that's almost like another layer that you can superimpose in the model. I mean, you can sort of say, well, yes, maybe this policy, as you will see, generates gains for the model distribution, the cost of inflation, but then inflation happens to be actually especially costly for these people. I mean, it's a bit of a quantitative question. There are so many channels that, but they're not in the model. Okay, good. So I'm ready, after this long introduction, I'm ready to discuss the model. So the model is written in continuous time. Individuals can be in one of 5 states. They can be employed, unemployed, and non-participant. In between unemployment, we distinguish 2 states, eligible for UI and ineligible for UI. And between the non-participants, we're going to distinguish 2 states, what we call active non-participant and passive non-participant. We're introducing this sort of active non-participant state because in the data, we do see direct transitions from non-participation to employment. And so we're allowing for that. And we are allowing for this state where job offers arrive at a certain rate.
So the N1 guys are people that could get benefits, but somehow they don't claim
them? Not really. I mean, the U1 guys are the ones that are eligible and get the benefits. U0, they don't get the benefits essentially because, well, either because the benefits expire or because they enter from non-participation into unemployment, okay? These guys, they don't get unemployment benefits. They are just effectively, even though we don't model it explicitly, these guys are searching with a certain search intensity is very low, say, and these guys are not searching at all, so they're not. So the lambdas represents the rate at which job offers, if you like, or job opportunities arrive to individuals. As you can see, they're indexed by Z, which means that they are, and Z is the skill of the individuals, which means that they're heterogeneous across skills, and that's sort of baked into this exogenous function. But then, for example, take the U1 state, okay? So the U1 state says that, at some rate, which is lambda UEZ at time t, individuals receive a job opportunities. This triangle means that there is a decision, there is a job acceptance decision, so they decide whether to enter employment or not. At some exogenous rate, they lose eligibility, okay? This is, to match the average duration of unemployment. And then, at some exogenous rate, they enter passive non-participation. Okay, this is just a shock. But they can make endogenously a decision whether to go from unemployment to non-participation, for example. Okay, and then we kind of fill the whole matrix like that. These skills Z are stochastic, and they evolve over time in the following way. There is some mean reversion, which is sort of moderated by this parameter theta. And then there are 2 drifts. There is a positive drift when the individual is employed, and there is a negative drift when the individual is unemployed. And then there are some shocks here, as you can see. So there is exposed heterogeneity. There is effectively there will be a lot of persistence in these skills. Okay, but potentially, you can kind of move up and move down the skill distribution. Okay, let me just summarize the individual problem. So this is period utility. Households obtain utility from consumption and this utility from hours, and that kappa is a fixed cost of being in one of these states. Okay, so for example, the cost of non-participation is normalized to 0. Then there's a small cost of being unemployed, which is like a search cost, and a larger cost of being employed, which is the cost of, you can think of that as like a fixed cost of working. The budget constraint is sort of standard. The only thing that I want to notice is that there is a labor tax on earnings. W is the wage, Z is skills, H is hours. There is a lump sum transfer fee that is paid to everybody. The individuals are subject to a no borrowing constraint, as you can see here. Workers make effectively 3 decisions. They make a consumption saving decision, a participation decision, and a job acceptance decision. okay, when they have a job opportunity. On the production side, so this is the household block with all the heterogeneity driven by the skill dynamics and the marketing completeness. On the production side, there is a continuum monopolistic intermediate good producers with flexible prices. Okay, so we're going to put the nominal rigidities on wages. They have a linear technology in labor, so constant return to scale, effectively, there is a representative final good producer that a CS aggregator of the intermediate goods, and this is the overall output of these final good producers. As you can see, basically, there's going to be sort of an intensive marginal labor supply, an extensive marginal labor supply. This is employment, and an endogenous average labor productivity. That's important. I'm going to talk about this also later, and sort of in the simulation as well. Average labor productivity is endogenous for two reasons. Okay, one is that there's going to be selection into employment, in and out of employment, because of these shocks, right? So in particular, when a negative shock hits, there are going to be a bunch of separations. The people who separate, they're more likely to separate are the ones at the bottom of the distribution. So at the beginning, there's a positive selection effect. But then, for example, because these aggregate shocks are persistent, as more people remain unemployed, skills tend to depreciate, and so average productivity tends to fall. But yes. So in terms of the nominal wage setting, we're kind of following the standard sort of way to do it in the New Keynesian model, which follows this sort of Herzog et al. Paper, adapted to an heterogeneous Asian model by Okun et al. Our adaptation is a little bit different because we have this participation margin, but essentially the idea of the model is exactly the same. So there is a monopoly union. I mean, there is a continuum, in fact. There's a continuum, to be precise, there is a continuum of monopoly unions which are small relative to the aggregate. So they take all prices and decisions as given, except for the nominal wage. That they set, in fact, a nominal wage to maximize the utility of all employed workers, facing a quadratic adjustment cost a la Rothenberg. This is the cost of sort of deviations of wage growth from the inflation target. Pi star is the inflation target. Okay, so the reason why we have the inflation target there is because we want to capture this idea that if I'm the union and I know that inflation is going to grow at 2% forever, then I can just basically set an automatic indexation clause into the contract, and there is no friction whatsoever. Okay, these are basically frictions that the wage setters face when there are shocks, unexpected shocks, and when they have to basically deviate from the plan. Then they allocate, the union allocates rules uniformly across all workers, but again, this is not really crucial. And you solve this problem, and you obtain a wage Phillips curve that looks like this. So for those of you who are sort of familiar with this expression in this literature, essentially, what matters it's in this square bracket, and it's essentially the deviation between the marginal utility of an extra hour and the markup times the wage, okay, which is what sort of generates inflation or deflation. What is different here is the following: that the marginal utility of consumption that weights the wage is weighted by productivities. That's not super crucial quantitatively. What is important is that you have this element here, which is average labor productivity of employed workers, this aggregate ZET, and that's going to move over time. Okay, so in particular, what this tells you is that an increase in labor productivity in general, if you are subject to a positive shock, and there is an increase in labor productivity, this increase in labor productivity is going to moderate inflation pressures, okay? And this is all endogenous. So why is this interesting? It's interesting because, in a way, if you think about these policies, they try to run the economy hot for longer, and they generate these productivity gains, especially at the bottom of the distribution, but in general, they generate these labor productivity gains. These are gains that could contain the inflation pressures of the policy itself. Very important. Very important. These unions are small, okay? They're small. There is a continuum of unions. The way the model is set up is that there is a continuum of tasks, and there is a union for each task. So the union is small and takes as given everything, including workers' decisions, which are participation decisions. Okay? So a single union doesn't take into account that by changing the nominal wage, it's going to attract more workers. Okay, great. All right, just to close the model, there is a fiscal authority with a government budget constraint. It's really like a sideshow to a large extent. And then there is this monetary authority that in the baseline model follows an inflation targeting rule for the nominal rate IT. This targeting rule is basically a standard Taylor rule where there is some weight on inflation and some weight on unemployment with some smoothing parameter. Okay, this is just a smoothing parameter that makes the nominal rate not move around too much or too quickly. So the reason why this is the baseline, okay, and we're basically are going to calibrate the model and invert the model to obtain the shocks that hit the economy from 1980 to 2020 under this rule. Okay, and then we do counterfactual with the other rule. That's why we want this rule. Okay, so let me tell you about the aggregate shocks. So we have two shocks which are kind of standard. Okay, one is a wage in the Euler equation that, with a bit of an abuse of language, I'm going to call a demand shock. And the other one is a sort of a standard cost push shock in the wage Phillips curve that I'm going to call a supply shock. Okay, so I'm going to use demand and supply shocks to think about these two perturbances. So what do these shocks do to the labor market? So as I said, we don't have in the model this sort of endogenous job creation margin. Okay, so what we do the following: we assume that all these lambda function, in particular the job finding rate for the unemployed and the non-participants, and the separation rate, they shift up and down as a function of average hours worked. So effectively, think about the following: suppose there is a shock, a demand shock. This increases the aggregate demand for the final good, and therefore increases the demand for the labor input. The increasing demand for the labor input is going to increase hours. It's going to increase the demand for hours, obviously, by firms along the intensive margin. And because the lambdas are a function of hours, it's going to increase the job finding rate, and it's going to decrease the separation rate. And that generates movements in the extensive margin. Okay, so sort of the shocks endogenously generate movements in hours, and then there is a mechanical relationship between this and the lambdas.
The unions are aware of this.
The unions are fully aware of this. Yes, of course. Yeah. Yes. Although again, this part here doesn't really matter for the union because of the reason that because they take the but yes. Okay. What else do I need to say here? Well, that basically the way we're going to incorporate these shifts is we're going to basically take them from the data. Okay, so we estimate from the data these the way these lambdas are a function of z across the skill distribution, which we take as being the wage distribution. And then we see that basically over the business cycle, these lambda functions, they move sort of up and down, okay? And we're gonna, they mostly shift, they sort of shift, they shift upward with good shocks. These shift upward under good shock, and these shifts downward under good shocks. And we're going to replicate this shift by making this shift as a function of hours. in order to make sure that over the whole simulation, so over the, say, the business cycle, labor input fluctuates along the intensive margin and the extensive margin with the shares that we see in the data, okay? And it's still true, this like 1/3, 2/3 that, that Prescott talked about 30 years ago is still true today. And we generate basically this 1/3, 2/3 shares of fluctuation of aggregate hours through intensive and extensive margin. Okay, so I'm going to, how much time do I have? About 35 minutes? So 40, no?
35 minutes.
35, okay. So I'm going to, okay, so let me talk briefly about the parameterization then. The moments on the, so we have a number of parameters. The moments on the left-hand side of this table are the ones that we target. And so what we target, so we target the liquid well to annual earnings for the discount, right? So we have a sort of a liquid well calibration that gives us a pretty high MPC this way. Then we have all these parameters in the skill dynamics, okay? The two key parameters are the delta plus and the delta minus, the upward drift and the downward drift. So what we do, we try to match basically earnings growth over the life cycle and earning losses upon displacement. And we do a pretty good job in matching those. Then we match the average stocks and flows, and we do pretty well also in that dimension, I would say. And on the right-hand side, you have some moments that we don't target, moments of the distribution of earnings, the distribution of earning losses, and the employment and unemployment rates at different points in the distribution.
But I mean, Gianluca, hopefully, yes, the moment you target, the model does well, right? On
the left-hand side. Yes. The ones on the right-hand side, we don't target. Yeah. But we still do okay. Huh? Yeah. The model does also quite well in terms of labor market business cycle statistics. It's not perfect, and in particular, it's something we're looking at now. We have a lot more pro-cyclical labor force participation than in the data, but everything else is matched quite well. I want you to notice one thing here, but I actually on the previous one, on the size of these flows, okay? I want you to notice that the U to N flow, as you can see, is an order of oops. No. Sorry, wrong one. Anyway, this U to N flow is an order of magnitude bigger than the E to N flow, okay? Which means that when workers enter unemployment are actually quite likely to transition into non-participation. Okay, that rate was like 13%, around 13% per month. Thank you. As you can see, 13% per month, which is, which means that 1 out of 7 workers every month transition from unemployment to non-participation. I'm going to talk about this.
I guess so there's many more non-participants than unemployed, yeah? Is that right?
Say it again?
So there are many more non-participants in the market than unemployed.
Oh, yeah, like in the data.
So that flow
yes.
Yes. From the non-participation.
No, this is, yes, but this is not just in, yes. No, I agree. I mean, there is probably a factor of 10. Employment relative to unemployment is, yes, is at least a factor of 10, yeah. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a large flow from unemployment to non-participation, and this is what I'm going to try to explain next. Unemployment is extremely cyclical, so most of the movements, cyclical movements on non-participation are driven by unemployment, okay? This is what, in fact, let me turn to this slide where I explain this. So let me step back for a second. So what I want to explain now is basically how this Okun's hypothesis that I talked about in the beginning is incorporated into the model and determines certain dynamics of the labor market. And I talked about these sort of 3 channels that we have. Exposure, attachment, and persistence. Okay, remember the Okun's hypothesis, the idea that a high-pressure economy, a hot labor market, is particularly beneficial to the bottom of the distribution. So let me explain the way we have this in the model. The first channel is exposure. And as I said, there is this evidence, and we see it in our lambdas functions, that the incidence of business cycle is uneven across the distribution. In particular, for example, the unemployment of low-wage workers is a lot more sensitive to the cycle than the unemployment of the high-wage workers. Okay, and that is basically baked into these lambdas in our model. That's true for both separation rates and job finding rates. Okay, particularly for separation rates, actually. The second channel is this labor force attachment channel. So this point that I was making earlier about the relative size has the following implication. Unemployment is extremely cyclical, obviously. It's one of the most cyclical variables in the business cycle. So this means that because unemployment is such a stepping stone towards non-participation, most of the cyclical movements in non-participation are driven by the unemployment stock. So when unemployment is very high, in bad times, there is a large flow from unemployment to non-participation that determines the rise in non-participation. So not so much the average, but the cyclical fluctuations are driven by unemployment. This is a point that was made by Obey and ENSAI in a recent paper. They call it the attachment wedge. And they explain that basically the dynamics of cyclical dynamics of participation rates are really, really very much linked to unemployment for this reason.
The transition from unemployment to non-participation does not drop that much in...
No, it's not very cyclical.
Okay.
It's not very cyclical, yeah. That I had it on a previous slide. The third channel is this persistent channel, which is related to the long-term earning losses upon displacement, widely documented, in particular by this paper by Davis and von Wachter. As in the data in our model, losses from job displacement are large, they're persistent, they are counter-cyclical, they're large in recession and expansion. So when you put these things together, you see that a high-pressure economy, so an economy that sort of avoids high unemployment for a long period of time, so after a recession, during a recovery, allows low-wage workers to find and retain employment more quickly, sustains their attachment to the labor force, and therefore limits this persistent earning loss upon displacement, okay, and these persistent effects. So you see this at work very clearly in the simulation of the model. This is an impulse response function out of a demand shock, or demand shocks, and this is the outcomes of unemployment, participation, labor income at the top quartile of the distribution, at the bottom quartile of the distribution. Here you see the exposure. You see that unemployment at the bottom is fluctuates more than unemployment at the top. All right. Because of this, participation at the bottom increases more than participation at the top. Okay. And because of this sort of earnings persistence and skill persistence channel that is sort of associated with this earning loss upon layoff, and associated with the fact that as you stay employed, your earnings go north, move north, you see the persistence, the positive effect on labor income, which is higher, but in particular a lot more persistent at the bottom than the top. Okay, I mean eventually all these go back to steady state. All right, it just takes, it's very fast. These sort of dynamics are much faster at the top and the middle than at the bottom.
What's the shock here?
It's a demand shock. It's a shock to the Euler equation. Okay, so let me turn to the policy experiments. So I'm going to think about three rules, okay? Alternative rules. The first one I showed you already, is the baseline inflation target. The second one, I'm going to call it average inflation target, and it's essentially a rule, as you can see, that on top of the Taylor rule, put some weights on past average inflation. This is the average inflation over the past 5 years, this PyMA. The shortfall rule, and this, I forgot to ask the question about the shortfall rule. I see you asked the question. The shortfall rule, that's the way we model it, okay? We model it in the following way. We're essentially letting we're taking the sort of the power statement sort of word for word, and we are letting the central bank respond to unemployment only when unemployment goes above target, above steady state, essentially. When unemployment is below steady state, so this is an example of the economy being hot, the Fed doesn't respond. It doesn't do anything in response to the change, in response to the lower unemployment rate. Obviously, it still responds to inflation. So to the extent that this policy generates more inflation, the Fed is going to react to inflation, but with the same weight. Okay? What we call lower for longer is a combination of our inflation target and the shortfall rule. Okay, which are sort of these two modifications that I showed at the beginning. All right. So I have 3 ways of assessing this new framework, this kind of lower for longer rule. The first one is called short run, the second medium run, and the third long run. The short run is one business cycle, just one simulation, basically. We're going to essentially go back to the Great Recession and think, what would have happened in the recovery from the Great Recession if the Fed had followed a lower for longer rule instead of standard inflation targeting? The second, we call it a medium run, is a simulation of the ergodic distribution in the model under the shocks that we estimated, the shock process that we estimated with the inversion that I described earlier. The third, which we're going to call the long run, is the following. We're going to say, well, in this ergodic distribution, we see an inflation bias. We see a systematic inflation bias generated by the shortfall rule. It's not surprising, right? It's an asymmetric rule. It generates an inflation bias that is actually, you see, more than compensates the negative bias of the ZLB. But then maybe this wage setter is going to take into account, and if they take into account, to what extent, basically, all these results cannot survive. Okay, let me start from the short run.
So in the first two, the unions are not responding to...
No, the unions are not. No, the unions are not responding to the inflation bias.
Ignorant about the...
Yeah, they're sort of.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This you can think of it as a world where it's like it's one business cycle, it's one cycle. It's the first time that this happens, and they're totally taken by surprise. This one you can think of it as in the following way that in the end you will see the bias is really not very large. It's quite small. And so you can think if there are information frictions or anything like, the response would be not fully taken into account, and this is like fully taken into account. So here's a simulation of the model in the Great Recession: unemployment, participation, output, inflation, nominal rate, and productivity. We invert the model by matching unemployment and inflation in order to recover the demand shock and the supply shock. So these are exactly the data, right? These two series, and these are kind of model implied. But for example, as you can see, the model does pretty well. Actually, does pretty well for everything, but in particular for the nominal rate, because it generates this ZLB that kind of binds for almost 4 years. Okay. So what happens? Okay. So these are the outcomes at the top and the bottom of the distribution implied by the model. You see clearly much bigger unemployment fluctuations at the bottom. You see that while participation had recovered, more than recovered by 2020, participation at the bottom was still lagging. Okay, and this is labor earnings.
You have demand and supply.
Yeah. I mean, this is a combination. This is a simulation, which is a combination of demand and supply shocks that we estimate from the data. I don't have the plot here, but
You did linearize the model, right?
we did linearize the model. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Okay, so here's what happened. What would have happened under the lower for longer rule, right? So I'm going to basically plot, as you can see, 2 additional rules compared to the blue line, which is inflation targeting. One is the shortfall rule alone, which is the orange line. The other one is the lower for longer, which is shortfall plus AIT. So the difference between the green and the red is the effect of the AIT, the average inflation targeting. All right? So let's think first about what the shortfall does. As you can see, basically, what the shortfall does, it does the following. As soon as unemployment goes sort of below U star, the Fed, relative to IT, they stop reacting, okay? So they let the economy run hotter, which generates a much lower unemployment rate for the bottom, also for the top, but for the bottom. It generates, as you can see, generates a kind of a full recovery of the participation rates by 2020, and an increase in labor earnings related to the inflation targeting by something like 10 percentage points. These effects are there at the top as well, but they're much smaller. It's interesting to look at the difference in the green line and the red line, because what you can see is that basically what the average inflation targeting does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is that without the average inflation targeting part, nothing would change in the simulation of the economy until the economy really enters an expansion, okay? But with average inflation targeting, you start seeing some real effects, which are especially strong at the bottom, also during the ZLB, during the recession, because the economy can lift off the ZLB much earlier. Okay, this is the cost of running a high-pressure economy, obviously, okay? So you can see that there is more inflation in the recovery, and in particular, by 2020, inflation would be probably like 2 percentage points, like a bit less, maybe 1 point, yeah. Okay, so here's clear, right? The more inflation in the recovery, which is kind of exactly this inflation inclusion trade-off gives you. Let me talk about the medium run now. Here, basically, we're kind of running, like a very long simulation, so we're getting kind of the ergodic distribution. What I'm going to show you here are sort of the averages, and essentially this is the 90-10 of the ergodic distribution for inflation, output, unemployment rate, participation, labor earnings, under the 3 rules, under the IT, the shortfall, and the lower for longer. What you should see here is that there is one thing that all these rules achieve, which is basically reverting the negative contractionary bias of the ZLB for all the aggregate variables. You see that, this is relative to steady state, right? So there is a negative bias, there is a negative inflation bias, small but negative, negative output bias, which is actually sizable, positive bias for unemployment rate, negative participation, negative for labor earnings. And what these rules do, they generate gains in all these outcomes that revert the bias of the ZLB. What is more interesting are these distributional implications. And essentially, what you see here is that if you compare the top with the bottom, all these gains and all this reversion of the bias is much stronger for the bottom than on the top. Okay, I mean, in particular, I mean, I don't have here. This is actually not. It's not really labor earnings. This is earnings per worker. But the bias for total earnings at the bottom is 3%. It's 3%. Okay, so this means basically that effectively what the ZLB is like a labor income tax of 3% for the low wage people. Okay, which is it's pretty sizable if you think about it. So what these rules do, they go all the way to reverting this bias, and they go even further, in a way, the way we implemented it at least, they go even further by generating all these gains. You see that basically at the top almost nothing happens, but at the bottom you get these big gains. Okay, so this table gives you basically a decomposition of these 3 channels, the Okun channels that I talked about. Basically this exposure, attachment, and persistence, if you like. expressed the following way, right? If you think about total labor income at the top and the bottom quartile of the distribution, you can think of this total labor income as, employed. This is the employment rate, times the participation rate, times this is earnings per worker. Okay, it's the wage times productivity times hours per worker, so earnings per worker. So you will see basically the effect of the exposure here, the effect of the attachment here, and the effect of the skill dynamics, the persistence here. So the comparison that I'm showing you here is the comparison in average outcomes between the lower for longer rule and the IT rule for total earnings at the top 25 and the bottom 25 of the distribution. You see that on average earnings increase by 2%, 1.5% for the top, so almost nothing, but 11% at the bottom of the distribution. Okay? Where do these gains come from? This is the composition. You see that at the top, they mostly come from the skill dynamics because the top distribution is very little exposed to unemployment and they always work. So these gains, they mostly come from the skill dynamics. But at the bottom, they mostly come from this extensive participation margin because the policy keeps people into the labor force, and also to a large extent through the skill dynamics because by keeping into the labor force, the skills increase. And this gives you this permanent increase of earnings around 11%. So I want to conclude with this, which is a bit more fun. These things, we call them the Okun cones. Okay, so what are the Okun cones? So it's a way kind of to assess this inflation-inclusion trade-off for the policymaker. Okay, so what we do, we take this lower for longer rule, and we vary the coefficients of this rule to trace out this trade-off. Okay, so we're going to have some rules that are extremely tolerant during expansions, and others that are a bit less. And we compare these outcomes relative to the inflation targeting in terms of the gains in terms of unemployment, participation, and earnings for the whole distribution against inflation. Okay, so for example, let me tell you what this 0.2 means. 0.2 means that you can basically choose a particular lower for longer rule that gives you 20 basis points of inflation extra and generates these gains across the distribution. This for the top, this for the bottom. All right? Same for participation, same for earnings. So this is, the way we think about it is a menu for the policymaker in the following sense. So suppose the policymaker says, well, I am very averse to inflation. At most, I'm going to allow, persistent deviation of inflation from target of, something like 20 basis points. Well, we say with 20 basis points, you can get unemployment at the bottom lower by 1 percentage point. You can get participation at the bottom higher by 0.7 percentage points, and you can get 3% higher earnings. So I guess in terms of the short, medium run, long run comparison, what happens in the long run as wage setters incorporate these systematic inflation bias into their behavior is these cones basically, they move to the left and they shrink. And in the end, they're going to become like a line at zero with higher inflation. So all you get is higher inflation, you don't get any real outcome. So to the extent, that you think that, the more you think these wage setters are fully rational, even for these small deviations, the more these will move to the left. Okay, that's it. This is the long run stuff that I talked about already. So, going back to the 3 questions, then I conclude. The first question we asked, how can you normalize Okun's hypothesis in a macro model? And we talked about these 3 channels and how we incorporate these 3 channels in the model. Can the lower for longer strategy run an economy hot for longer and generate this trade-off? Yes, and we showed you through the Okun's cone basically what this policy can do. Can this trade-off be sustained in the long run? If inflation bias becomes fully ingrained in wage setting, then the trade-off steepens sharply and then eventually disappears.
Thank you very much, Gianluca.
Thank you for your feedback.